Hey everybody, welcome back to Me, Myself, and Die. I'm, as always, your intrepid host, GM, and player Trevor Duval. Today we're doing something rather special. As those of you who've been following the channel know, I've been playing 5 Parsecs from Home, a miniatures tabletop sci-fi game, the playlist of which is right there. And today, I am so pleased to be joined by the creator of that game and other games as well, Mr. Ivan Sorensen. Ivan, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I love your game, man. I found it. I don't remember how I found it. I think maybe Modifius sent it to me. Maybe on like Twitter or something. They said, "Hey, you should look at this." And I looked at this and went, "This is great. Let me get to it in like a year." And so I finally did. And the reason why, of course, you're talking to me today is because I got this email from you a few days ago just saying, "Hey, good job. Love the show," which I was, just tickled to have the creator of the game give a compliment. So, of course, I reached out to you to talk about the game. So, for those who don't know who you are, why don't you give me just a little 30 seconds or less about, what your background is, how you came to become a game designer, all that good stuff.
Yeah. Well, my name is Ivan. I grew up in Denmark. I live in the United States currently. So I'm a citizen of the world, I guess. And other than like always having a passion for games, I was always interested in like how games work. Like even as a kid, I would try to like put together my own like little games with like Legos and some dice and stuff. I'm sure none of it like ever worked, but so it was always just fascinating to me, like being able to. It's like how I know you've worked with movies and television. I feel like there's people who can like intuitively look at like a show or a film and they can see all the pieces of how it came together. Like they can see, this scene works because of the editing or because of the direction, because these specific things, and they all like, and yeah, like I can't do that for film. I'm stupid. I'm not a visual person, but I can do it for game mechanics. I could always like look at it and figure out like, oh, this is how these pieces go together. And I just found it really exciting. And then at some point, if you're enough of a nerd, you can transfer that to a monetizable skill. And so I did.
So what was the first game you designed?
So the first game I designed that I remember, do you mean like ever or just in a like other human beings played this thing?
Well, no, let's talk ever, because those early days of inspiration are just as formative as anything else.
Yeah. So as a kid, I never had a Nintendo, but for some reason, my parents would buy me copies of whatever the Danish like equivalent of Nintendo Power was, and I was fascinated. Of course, I had friends who had like Commodore 64 or whatever at the time, so I was into video games, but it took a while before we had anything at home that could play them. So I was really fascinated, and I remember there was an article about Street Fighter 2. And it had all the characters and had all the moves. And I put together my own little way of being able to play Street Fighter 2, which I couldn't because I didn't have anything that could play it. And I remember I wrote up, like, I looked at all the moves and I wrote up like little damage values for them and dice rolls. And then I would have the characters like fight each other. And I would just have them written out on paper and I would just choose like who got to fight. And that is the earliest I can think of that was like a game that I made that was like, it could technically be played. I'm sure it was like super boring because it's just a dice game.
And how old were you when you did that?
Well, whenever Street Fighter 2 came out is how old I was. I want to say like 9 or 10, something like that.
Okay. All right.
I had been exposed to role-playing games, mostly through like Fighting Fantasy and Lone Wolf, like the solo game books and stuff. And from there, although it took a long time before I really had like friends to play with who were like as excited about it as I was and who weren't just complete weirdos. Like so you could play like a real game as opposed to just trying to murder each other. But I was always like really into that, and so the idea of making other things into games to seem like a logical thing.
So did you say, or do you think that your excuse me, your world of gaming, would it start with role play games, or did it start with like dice games and tactical miniature kind of games?
It really started with role playing games. Well, actually, I'm going to cheat a little bit because the first sort of like real game that I owned was actually the old Hero Quest board game.
Oh yeah.
The one.
Yeah.
Yeah, like everyone who was around at that time played Hero Quest. It was just such a, and it was sort of that like perfect middle ground because it had like miniatures and like pretty lavish stuff at the time. And had a little bit of RPG vibe, and
Yeah, it was kind of like a precursor to Warhammer, wasn't it? Hero Quest, because if you look at those early designs and everything, you can see where the Chaos warriors came from and all that
yeah, yeah,
stuff.
yeah. It had there was kind of an official link. I think Milton Bradley actually had a license for it because they also did Space Crusade, which was the same principle but for
Right,
40K.
right.
Um, so the idea of like this sort of mushy zone of like role playing games and miniatures was always kind of a thing. But role playing games were easier to get a hold of. Like I was lucky that the school library where I grew up had you'd go get like the player's handbook from like Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and stuff from the library. So we could get a bunch of like games that we couldn't afford because we were kids, we didn't have money, and
Yeah.
these were like often expensive like imports anyway in
Right,
Denmark.
right.
Um, but Hero Quest definitely like laid the seed, like, oh, okay. Which is funny because we never played role playing games with miniatures, even though in games that like suggested it, like AD&D and stuff. But at some point, I don't remember how I got to it. I ended up seeing Warhammer 40K. This was the second edition box set. This was the first box set they had done. It was pretty new when I saw it, and we recognized it from Space Crusade because we had played the board game. We had played the like computer version. We kind of recognized like the look and the vibe of it, and I somehow managed to beg and cajole my grandparents into buying it for me. And that box just absolutely blew my mind. It was just, like these big books, they were just full of like archaic, weird stuff. And every single page it turned to was just something that was amazing. All these wild creatures and all this cool stuff, like, oh my God, you put like this template down on top of like a unit when you throw grenades at them. Like it was heady stuff. And I was trying to, like I was pretty good with English even as a kid. But it was still daunting, like this was this big complex game that was meant for, kids older than my age probably and in English.
Right.
So it was this, yeah, it's weird because it's just like a dumb game, but it was like a very formative experience for me in a lot of ways. That really like blew, like from that moment on, there was just no going back. Like that was what I wanted.
So going from that point now to, was it 5 Parsecs? That was your first sort of big published game, or did you have things before that?
If you say big, yes. I actually had a World War One game that a now defunct company out of New England. I think they were like the importer for a UK range of World War One miniatures, and they wanted a little game to go with it, just to kind of like promote a little bit. And I had done one called Trench Storm, which I had put up online. This was in the age of like Yahoo groups,
Right.
so it's a hot minute ago. And that had blown my mind because I had been writing games that I like played with my friends group, and like if you're the guy who like comes up with stuff, your friends will put up with anything, and they're not going to tell you how stupid it is. But this was the first time I had written something that like people who didn't have any reason to be like well disposed towards me like said like, oh yeah, this is cool. Like I remember getting an email from somebody saying that he had gone out and bought miniatures from, I think, Pendragon, who does 10 millimeter World War One figures. And I was like, oh my God, like I wrote something and somebody like went and bought figures for it. Like that seems so unbelievable. So that distributor, they had emailed me and said they wanted that game to promote their rules. So I wrote it up a little nicer, did some more stuff. And I think I don't know how many it sold. I got paid for 200 copies, which was heady at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how many they actually sold. They went out of business at some point. I lost contact. So maybe somebody out there owes me like $80. But that was the first like commercial game, which taught me a couple of things because they like messed up a bunch of stuff in the book. And I was really mad about it. And after a while, you realize like whatever. But it was a good experience. But yeah, 5 Parsecs was the first like big glossy thing, and Modiphius obviously like went big on like production values and stuff.
So how did you come to 5 Parsecs from Home? How did you come to the setting, the game rules? Like what was your initial inspirations, that kind of thing?
Yeah. So I guess the settings and the rules and playstyle are almost like separate things. I think the playstyle was just one of those things that I had always been like fascinated with. Like we played, I don't know how much of a background you have for like Games Workshop stuff, But we played the original Necromunda a lot.
Okay.
Like we lived in that game for a while. And that sort of vibe of like a handful of characters and they'll like level up and they have stuff and you follow them. That was always really strong to me. And I always liked the idea because you always anyone who played that game, and the same for like Mordheim or some of those,
Yeah.
they always have stories about what happened. And when you listen to them, you realize a lot of times those stories are, I don't want to say they're banal because they're not. They're obviously important to people, but they're based on like very simple stuff. It's like, oh, this guy like missed 4 crossbow shots in the same game, and that's not the game didn't do anything to make that, but because that's your guy that you painted up and you've had him for a while, like
Right.
it becomes significant. And I always thought that was really cool. So that, and there was a series of games called 5150 by 2 Hour War Games, which are also kind of, he was one of the first to do this sort of like solo oriented, more campaign driven play. And we were really into those games as well. So I think it was just one of those things where like, okay, I really want to do something with that style. I had experimented with it a little bit for like World War II games and stuff. So doing it for sci-fi just seemed like the obvious thing. I was always into science fiction.
More so than fantasy, would you say?
Yeah, fantasy for me is more of an RPG thing.
Right.
And that sounds funny since, 5 leagues is the thing now. But yeah, I'm honestly more like a historical gamer of anything. But yeah, I always just enjoyed science fiction more than fantasy. I think part of it is, at least when I grew up, science fiction novels tended to be better. This is kind of the height of like tie-in and like D&D, like fantasy novels, some of which were of moderate quality.
Questionable quality. Yes.
Yeah,
As much as I loved Ed Greenwood's contribution to the fantasy world, he developed the Forgotten Realms, but as a novelist, not so much. Not so much as the novelist.
And I mean, I'm easily pleased, so I'm not bagging on anybody. But
well,
I feel like
speaking of easily pleased, one thing as we're talking about this, something that occurred to me that I really appreciate about your game, because 5 Parsecs is the only one I'm familiar with. A lot of people are saying, "Hey, you got to try 5 Leagues," and I think that's in the future for sure. But with 5 Parsecs, what I love about it in juxtaposition to Games Workshop, which I don't think I'm legally allowed to mention, or else I'll get sued. But but what I like about your game is that when you take a shot at somebody, and if you hit them, something happens. I love that. Either they get taken out or they get stunned and there's a consequence. Because in so many of those other Games Workshop games, you could roll and you miss. Okay, but you roll and you hit. Oh, but then he made his armor save. Roll and a hit. Oh, but it didn't get past his toughness. And I remember the RPGs that they developed out of that. As much as I love Warhammer Fantasy First Edition, like it's one of my favorite games of all time, still that basic chassis, which, again, it was developed in the 80s, so they were still working this stuff out. But that basic chassis has come to drive me crazy because a friend of mine runs all the 40K games, and I've played everything. I've played Rogue Trader and Death Watch and Dark Heresy, the whole bit. And I can't play them anymore. They drive me crazy because it's always a case of, you shoot. Oh, no, you missed. Okay. All right, you shoot and you hit him, but it didn't do enough damage. Okay, nothing happened. Okay, now it's over his toughness, but it just does some wounds and there's no, and it's like, God, I want something to happen. So in your game, I hit a guy and either he's taken out or he's stunned, and that's a consequence. And I love that because it makes things move faster for one thing. But it also feels like there's real consequences to those kind of choices. So I just, as an aside, I appreciate that design.
There's actually kind of so it's easy when you're writing stuff and people liking it. It's easy to like sound more clever than you really are, because it's some things just work out that way, and it turns out that how it went together just played well. In that case, it was something that was semi-intentional, because. And people sometimes run into this from the other side. They think, oh, the combat is too simple. Like a lot of people want more meat to it. They want, height advantages, or they want flanking fire, all these things. And one of the things I was trying to be very conscious of is 5 Parsecs is not just the miniatures component. I think that's maybe a different from some other games.
Yes.
Where the primary thing is the miniatures battle, and then there's, some resolution stuff at the end of it or whatever. But that's not what it was set up to be. It's the whole thing. It's sending your characters out to do their tasks. It's rolling for the consequences, implementing the events, and the
Yep.
battle. So I wanted the battle to be a little shorter so that you could do all of that in one sitting. I know some people will break it up. Like some people like to do like the pre-game stuff at the end of one mission, so they're ready to play next time. You know, that's fine. But it was all meant so that you could burn through it all in like one evening, or like do 2 missions in an evening. So in a lot of cases where it's a little on the simpler side of things, are kind of like pushed along, that's kind of the reason. It's to keep it in that sort of like, because it's meant to be like a unit. Like, I think if you took out the combat on its own with nothing else, it would end up feeling a little shallow, because there's not like that much going on.
Yeah, no, I totally understand what you mean, and that makes perfect sense. And honestly, that concept of the meaningful campaign bookending the battle is the thing that got me most excited about it. Because I remember when I first, when Kill Team first got released, Games Workshop sent me the game, and I was like, oh wow, and I was learning it. I was like, oh, this is cool. It's like it's the story of these particular guys. It was a little Mordheimy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's about individuals. And oh, look at this. After the battle, oh, now you can sort of, they advance and they have consequences to their actions. But there still wasn't that campaign element. There wasn't that narrative element to it. And so when I read yours, I was like, oh my God, this is everything I wanted Kill Team to be. You know what I mean? So yeah,
yeah. But there's kind of a trade-off for that, because on the flip side, you can play Kill Team pretty competitively. I don't know if people do necessarily. I think that crowd is a little more relaxed. But you can, and you can do a pickup game, and you can set up, I bring my dudes, you bring your dudes, and we're going to fight. And I selected to not really support that all that much intentionally, because, the focus is elsewhere. So it's kind of you have some trade-offs when you do stuff like that. But yeah.
But I think that comes through in the writing as well, because there is a in your book, like when you read the rules, it does not at all feel like a competitive game. Whereas sometimes you read some of the old Games Workshop, the 40K manuals, and yeah, obviously it is a competitive game, so they write it with that sort of, face forward. Whereas yours feels a little more, and maybe it's because it's solo, right? Maybe because it's just designed to be, hey, it's just me doing this stuff, but it feels a lot more relaxed. So did you always intend for this to be like this solo experience? Because I know in your book, at the end of the book, there's an option for like running it as a more traditional kind of game with like a referee and stuff. But was solo always kind of your primary focus for this thing?
Yeah. So over the years, I've done, especially on the independent side of things, I've done all kinds of stuff. I've written games that are directly competitive. I've written games that are meant to be game mastered. I've written games that are solo. And yeah, 5 Parsecs was always pretty much intended as a solo game. There's actually an original version in the Dawns of Time, which was a set of campaign rules for a different game I had written, very different core mechanics, which had sort of set the solo direction, but it wasn't 100% that way. It was kind of floating that, oh, well, maybe it's played with the GM, maybe it's not. When I redid it to what is the current game engine, which is the second edition, I made the decision to just narrow it down, because I figured people will still come up with cool scenarios. They'll come up with, some people will run, they'll game master a scenario, and they'll run, everyone brings a couple of characters or whatever. Like, people will figure that stuff out, and we've talked about supporting that more in the future. And I'm working on something kind of aimed more at that. But yeah, it very much is intended to be a solo game. It's the same reason that the solo mechanics are in each rules section. They're not like a separate snippet. So like when you read the combat rules, it explains how the enemy shoots. It explains how they choose their targets, as opposed to going, because I play a lot of board games. A lot of times you get the solo rules are like a separate little sheet.
Right.
So you have to like read through the rule book, and then you have to go see which of those are modified to account for the AI or whatever.
Right. It's almost like learning 2 different games a lot of the times, whereas yours is clearly not like it. Yeah.
Yeah. Part of it is just like personal preference, because I get really frustrated learning games like that. So I didn't want it to be like that. But yeah, I think it also helps just put it up front. When Modifius had contacted me, we had kind of talked about that they wanted something where solo didn't feel like it was like the second best option. Like, oh, if you're a sad loser, turn to page 30. Like, you know. Uh, but it was something like, oh, I can like have this cool hobby, and it's not. It doesn't have to be separate from like if you play in like a War Machine League, that's fine.
Right.
This isn't, but it's something you can do on your own. You can have these cool adventures and do stuff, and it's a legitimate way to play. So part of it kind of played to like their intentions for that, which are like, oh yeah, I'm into that.
Yeah. So how did you come to be working with Modiphius on the project?
They reached out, actually. They had originally reached out about a different game called Starport Scum, which was in a similar vein but more game master oriented, and we ended up just settling that Parsecs was a better deal, from being more of a out of the box experience, because I think solo gaming is one of those things that has like blown up in the last, well, I guess last several years. Like a lot of board games come with it now. Role-playing games, you start seeing stuff. There's what's it called, Iron Forge, and the sci-fi version.
Sworn, yeah.
Those oracles. Miniatures games are really like keying in. And at the time, it was still kind of like on the upswing. So, and I don't think we like caused it or anything. It was coming. It was happening. But they wanted something that was like really like keyed into that.
Had you self-published any aspect of the game first, or was this just a
yeah, there was a much thinner second edition out there with a bunch of stuff that had been supported over the years. So it was an existing game. They reached out, and like I said, they had originally asked for a different one, but we ended up talking. I was like, hey, how about this? And they ended up liking the look of it.
So how many years from the time when you said, okay, I've developed this game, 5 parsecs, how long was it between that point and when Modiphius said, hey, let's do a thing, let's have lunch?
That's a good question. It's several years. I think it was out there for like 4 or 5, just kind of like picking up, because I had the first games I self-published were all like mostly historical war games, World War II stuff like that. But a lot of them were still kind of circling around some of these ideas of solo play or like less traditional styles of play. So just kind of like picked up, like 2 people here. So it's like suddenly you see somebody on like Let Adventure post about it, like, hey, I'm playing this game. Like, oh, that's cool. And it starts like picking up like a person here and there. And then at some point, it just like ends up getting noticed, I suppose.
So,
but yeah, it had been out there for like 4 or 5 years, going through like, multiple tweaks and updates.
Right. And did you how did you publish it? Was it through like Drive-Thru-RPG or what was your?
Yeah, Wargame Vault.
Oh yeah, okay.
Like miniatures side of Drive-Thru, but yeah, that was how that was done.
And how did 5 Leagues from the Borderlands come to be?
That was essentially because that also had a self-published like earlier version, and that had come about essentially just because people kept asking for it. And I was like, okay, I kind of wanted to do. I like going back to the same ideas but changing them. So, like 5 Leagues there's a lot of the same structures. Like the turn sequence is the same. The stats are mostly similar. There's a lot of things, but a lot of things are different, like in the small, because I like to go back and say, okay, if hand-to-hand combat works like this is fine in the sci-fi game because you're not punching each other that much. But in a setting where everyone has swords, and that's how they like communicate and interact and resolve their differences, there needs to be more to it. So, okay, let's see if we can do like a more involved melee system, stuff like that. And part of it was, and now it feels a little like maybe overdone because like dark fantasy is like the default now. But at the time, like my fantasy inspirations were always like a little like skewed. Like I really like stuff like the Michael Moorcock, like Elric stories, like the Black Company, stuff like that. I didn't read The Witcher until much later, but it fits that same vibe. So it's like, I want to do something that's kind of like that. I want to do something that's like a little darker, a little grittier, has that kind of vibe of going out into the night and like fighting creepy crawlies and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really become as you say, it's the default now, it seems, for fantasy with the possible exception of like D&D stuff, which of course has its own
Dungeons & Dragons is still kind of doing like the big colorful And like anything, like it ends up being kind of overdone. Like like a lot of like gritty fantasy RPGs, but at the same time, it's like, can we have something where it's like, like saving the world is actually like, worth doing?
Yes.
Like
Right.
especially if you play like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, the way not even so much how it is in the books, but the way like some groups play it online, it's so goddamn. I don't know if I can swear on your show,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
it's
yeah,
so
yeah.
miserable. There's like just like let the Chaos Gods have this place. Like move to Norsca and like get drunk and wait for the tentacles to happen.
Exactly.
Like why would I save a single one of these sets? So it can get a little much, and sci-fi can be like that too. For like the sci-fi inspirations, because I feel like that's probably the next question coming up, so I'm just going to preempt you. I was kind of in the odd position because one, my sci-fi inspirations weren't really like that much of like what's the normal stuff. Like yeah, I watched Star Wars as a kid, but it just never like caught me that much. In a sense, because I'm like a smart kid or anything. I'm pretty dumb, but it was just never like that big a thing. I was born like right in that gap where you kind of had to hunt down like a VHS tape,
Right.
Before like the special editions came out. I didn't play Traveler until like much later, although I fell in love with it like after the fact. So the sci-fi stuff that I ended up being inspired by was this like weird melange of like random stuff like over the years, like some of it were like old like computer games and video games, which I know like as a designer you're supposed to only have been inspired by like books and novels and stuff, but like so yeah, there's like old weird 16-bit computer games I was really into. It was like, oh yeah, this is like how that looks. Like one of the races that converted in the book are taken from like the Quake video games, the Strogg, and that race was just like a ripoff of the Borg from Star Trek,
Right. Well, again, I think that any kind of quality sci-fi setting is both unique and derivative at the same time, because we like to recognize elements that make us feel, oh, that's cool. That's kind of like the Borg, which of course is exactly what you think when you think, but it's not like, oh, they're just ripping off the Borg. That it wasn't that. It was, oh, cool. This is a new spin on something that's already familiar, and so I can immediately hone in on this and understand what that is. And again, that's what I like when I read the books, and I'm coming up with the enemy. Who is the enemy? And as soon as I land on it, I know exactly what that looks like to me, because it's all familiar without being, because some sci-fi can be super outlandish where I don't really have a frame of reference for it, and I'm like, I don't know what this is, whereas
sometimes it can get, I think it's like a balance. Like you say, you have to have elements that are recognizable that people can key into, and then you can throw in a few things that are kind of weird, because there's players who are really into that, but you still have to like get them in.
Right.
And there's a couple of cases where, in hindsight, I guess I wish I had been a little more crafty. Like, there's a couple of races that are just straight out of Traveler, and maybe I could tweak them a little bit.
But there's so many options already that that's what I like. I like the fact that, oh, this is clearly the Aslan or whatever from Traveler, but that's okay because it's not the Aslan. It's this thing, and then there's these other races too. And like in the new one, I keep saying the Freeloaders handbook. It's not the
it depends on how well you roll for Traveler.
In the Freelancers, the races there. Oh, you've got your dwarves and your Skaven. Okay, that's great. But that's awesome because it's options there, and it doesn't feel like you're ripping things off. It feels almost like, well, we all in this space, we all sort of recognize this stuff, so let's pay homage to it. Let's have a little nod to it, and it's optional, so you can use it or not, right? So I love that.
Oh, absolutely. And I think some of it too is you have to give people an excuse to like go buy miniatures. Like nerds love nothing more than justification to go buy some crap. So if you tell people like, hey, do you own any like rat miniatures with laser guns? And people are like, no. Like, do you want some? Like, people will go, they'll go convert some and they'll go find some miniatures. So I think it's good to like throw that out there. Like, and then you can throw in some weird stuff. Like there's the manipulators, which is one of the like super minor aliens that are just like weird tentacle aliens. And it's hard to find like miniatures for that. So they're just kind of there to like, okay, somebody out there is going to like build this cool like double gunslinging tentacle monster, and it'll be great.
Especially today in the age of 3D printers. I mean, I have a lot of people on my show's Discord that do all kinds of mini stuff. And there was a fellow who actually, he built a miniature of one of the NPCs in the show. And he kind of altered it. So he took this miniature. It was the exact same mini I used in the show, but he altered it with these other things. And I was like, oh my God, of course you can do this. Like, this is completely in your power now. Whereas I think when we were kids, that was, how the hell do you do that? Like,
right. Or you had to like cut off the arm of like a metal figure and try to do a replacement arm, and it would look like ass.
Right, exactly. So, and you'd be like, oh my God, this beautiful Ral Partha figure, I can't possibly mutilate it and try, because I remember I grew up in the days of lead miniatures too, where you're sucking on those all morning.
Oh yeah.
So in terms of the whole miniature thing, is that a draw? Is that something that you thought, hey, this would be great that we can play this game and it's sort of miniatures agnostic? You don't have to have a specific line, an official line in order to play this? Because I know that's something that really attracted me to it, because I have like a scattershot group of miniatures. And so if I can just draw upon them to use them, then that's a huge advantage.
Yeah, I think that was just an outlook or a consequence of how I tend to like to do things. I often don't like buying miniatures for like specific games. Partial because I have been at various times into any number of games that don't exist anymore. So there's that feeling of like, oh, I have a 1,000 point army for Warzone. And guess what? Nobody plays Warzone anymore. Nobody ever will.
Right.
Like, that's cool.
Right.
So I tend to just buy miniatures for like, I like the look of this character. I like the look of this unit or whatever. I want like 2 squads of these guys. So it was just kind of a natural thing of like, okay, in that case, I want to play games like that. There was an old British sci-fi game called Stargrunt. It's kind of like come and gone. But it was one of the first games I read. And the company, Ground Zero Games, they have their own line of miniatures for it. They have, different armies and stuff. But the book had a little snippet up front saying, like, these are just the ones we make. Like, you should play with whatever miniatures you like. And I remember reading that and thinking like, oh, that is so cool. And the first time we played, it was literally without Warhammer stuff because that's what we had. But it was so cool. Like, not only can I go buy like some miniatures for this other game and use them, but my Warhammer dudes don't even have to be Warhammer dudes. They could just be, space soldiers or whatever.
I can hear all of the Games Workshop fanboys just screaming in rage right now. No!
Yeah, just imagine they're like proxy deathcore of Krieg minis. You'll understand. So, and I totally get the vibe, because some people are really into the idea. They want to be like in an ecosystem, and Warhammer is like this thing you can live inside,
right? Right.
Like you can read novels and buy miniatures and play the games and have the blanket and the breakfast cereal, like, and that's cool. But I was just never, I think part of it is I was never into like one specific thing for like all eternity. Like sometimes I want to do some space fantasy. Sometimes I want it to be like gritty, hard sci-fi. Sometimes I don't really care and I just want to like make pew pew noises.
Yeah, yeah. You bring up something. You bring up something I find quite interesting too. When you were talking about board games, and you said, I invested all this money and time into this game, and then all of a sudden it's no longer supported. I have some friends where I live now that are huge board gamers, like serious hardcore board gamers. Some of them are actually supporters of the show, and they have talked about this a lot, where they really get into like what was it? Guild Ball, I think was the big one they were playing.
Oh, yeah.
And they, oh my God, everybody was into this. It was so great. They invested all this time and money and stuff for these very specific miniatures that are really specific to that particular game. And then one day the company just goes, okay, that's it, we're out. And no more support, no more nothing. And you get all of these players going, but I have all of these very specific miniatures. And I never even, it didn't even occur to me as a potential problem until they started talking about it. So the fact that you are saying this, that's obviously a much bigger problem than just a local one.
Yeah, it's a concern. And I think it can hurt some games because I think for some people, there's also this vibe of like, Games Workshop isn't going anywhere. Like, 20 years ago, I could buy Warhammer army, and I can still use like most of that army today.
Yeah.
I have to figure out how the rules work and the army list, but like Games Workshop is still around and making Warhammer dudes. 20 years from now, they are presumably still around making Warhammer dudes. They might be bigger by now, but so there's the security in that. Whereas if it's some smaller game, like I see it a lot with like Kickstarter minis games, and I'm kind of cold on Kickstarter in general. I know that's like heresy for a board gamer, but I think it's a hesitation for people because they see this stuff coming out and like, okay, will this game like be around long enough to like have a community so I can go to the store and find people to play with? Will the armies like even get finished? Like if I don't buy like the cool cyber tank, can I ever buy it because they go out of production?
Yeah. No, this is the stuff that these guys are. It's exactly the same thing they're saying. So I think that's obviously because they have the same hesitation with Kickstarter now. The exact same thing. It's like, well, I've been burned, twice bitten, once shy, or whatever that is.
Yeah.
What's next? Is there anything coming up for you that you can talk about? Because I know when people ask me, when they say, hey, what's next? What cartoons you working on? I'm like, I can't say anything until like a year after. It's just...
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question because they don't really give me like specific, like, don't say this yet. But I try to be very like guarded with it.
Of course.
There's a couple of projects that we have talked about that have basically been signed off on. Two of which will be Parsecs standalone books. So the idea is that they'll be their own game. Actually, three. So holy shit.
Busy guy. All of a sudden.
I know, right? So there'll be standalone games that you don't need anything else to play them. They'll be essentially like their own game line, but they will be compatible to it, and you'll be able to transfer characters around. So the idea is that once you play like Parsecs from home for a while, it's not that it's replacing it, but it's like, hey, do you want this like other like experience?
Neat.
You want this other kind of thing. So like one will be a more military kind of thing. One will be kind of a colonist space, like planetary sort of thing. And the third is too early to really say because it may change.
That's cool, man. That's cool. I love, obviously I'm a big fan of the game, but I love the expansions. I love the directions that you seem like you're going in. I can see myself playing this game for a long time because there's so much in it. It's so deep. It's so rich. And because it's all random, man, anybody who's seen my show knows that's my holy grail. Like that's...
Solo gamers have like a much different appreciation for random content than I think typical, because I see a lot, especially on like drive-through, you'll get like D100 dungeon doors or whatever. Like people will trim that stuff out, but for a lot of that, I don't know how many people like actually like use that. Like I've never run a like game of RuneQuest or something where I stop and like, hey, let me roll to see what this door looks like. Nobody at the table is gonna care. But if the thing for the door was like, oh, this door is magically locked and there is a goblin in the dungeon that has the key, now the random element is generating play. It's sending you in a direction or it's making you do something. I think that's a big difference. Like, and I don't want to bag on anybody because everyone has like different things they're into, but like stuff like, oh, roll to see like what color the gems you found in the dungeon. Like for me, that's meaningless. That doesn't help me. Like it doesn't matter to me what color they are. They can all look like My Little Pony like stickers. But if some of those gems, like if the game tells me that, oh, this gem is like this, but if you sell it in this one specific town, it's worth double. Like, oh, now I have a reason to. Now it exists in the world. Like it's connected.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and that as you say, that is a fundamental difference maybe between solo players, or at least the focus on a lot of solo things, and regular like RPG groups around the table. Is the only details that matter are things that are basically actionable by the players. Otherwise, everything's window dressing that they probably won't even really register or hear. I mean, we've all had situations as GMs, I think, where we're waxing poetically about the various descriptive elements of the tourney that they're at, and you just know that they're hearing maybe one out of every 10 words. They're just thinking, "When's the joust? When's the joust? Okay, I'm +5 to hit in the joust. When's the joust?" So, but when you're doing the solo stuff,
or they keyed into like one side detail that you mentioned as a
Yeah,
throwaway
right,
thing.
right.
And now there could be
Right.
that's the assassin.
Right, exactly. And so it suddenly becomes this unintentional red herring, and you're like, no, it was just a description because this book of random tourney descriptions told me if I roll a 72, that's what it looks like.
Right.
Yeah, that's an interesting distinction. Perhaps I'll have to do a video on that one of these days, as people tend to dig that stuff. Well, we've been at it for a while now, so I'm not going to take any more of your time. But, dude, I love the game. Thank you so much for making it.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing it. Everyone was when your video started popping up, everyone on our Discord was super excited. Like, oh, this is like a cool person who's famous. Like, oh shit.
Well, they can all watch me get all the rules wrong, so that's always fun for people.
How much like crap do you get for?
Oh, and
sometimes audiences can be like a little spiky about that stuff.
Oh yeah, and I love me a rules lawyer. I just love me a rules lawyer. These people in the comments who are like, actually at 12:24, you specifically did this incorrectly. I'm like, I don't give a go away. Right. Anyway, so anyway, thanks for the game. I love it. I'll continue to play it, and thanks for joining me here today, man. This was great, super fun.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much for having me. It was a delight, and I look forward to your videos in the future.